Hi, everyone. Thanks for being so numerous back after the lunch break. So we'll kick off with our afternoon session with another medalist, and Shumit will introduce the medalist again.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. As President of the Geochemical Society, it's my privilege today to introduce the 2023 Victor Moritz Goldschmidt Award. The award is the Society's highest honor, presented annually for a major achievement in geochemistry over a career. We're pleased today to recognize the outstanding achievements of Roberta Rudnick for this year's medal. To present the citation, I'd now like to invite Fangshen Tang of the University of Washington.
It's working. Great. Thank you. Mr. President, colleagues, and friends, it's a great privilege and honor for me to introduce Roberta Rudnick for the V.M. Goldschmidt Award, the Society's highest honor. Okay. Roberta received her BS from Portland State University and a master's degree from Seoul Ross State University and a PhD from Australian National University, where she was supervised by Ross Taylor, a Goldschmidt medalist. After ANU, Roberta moved to Max Planck Institute for Chemistry, working with L. Hoffman, another Goldschmidt medalist. Roberta returned to ANU as a research fellow, collaborating with Ted Ringwood, another Goldschmidt medalist. So indeed, the saying holds true. You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. She then joined Harvard University as an assistant professor, then promoted to full professor with tenure within 6 years. Actually, she is the first woman promoted with tenure in earth sciences at Harvard University over the past over 200 years. Isn't it great? Well, you know, Boston is really too cold. So that's why she moved to University of Maryland in 2000. Well, I was so lucky to be able to work with Roberta and Bill as their student. In 2016, Roberta moved to UC Santa Barbara, where she can enjoy the beautiful ocean view every day. Roberta is a preeminent geochemist in studies origins and evolution of the continents, formation and destruction of the lithospheric mantle, and is a pioneer in studying lithium isotope geochemistry. Well, her citation scores, I know you want to say it, is one of the most highest among geochemists. Roberta realized that the lower crust is not mafic enough to balance the intermediate composition of the bulk crust, setting off several decades of research and profoundly advancing our understanding of processes that form the continental crust. Recently, Roberta and her longtime collaborator, Bill McDonough, and their former postdoc, Richard Gashnick, established an international collaboration to study the chemical and isotopic evolution of the crust through 2.9 to 0.3 billion years old diamcitites. Concurrently, Roberta and former PhD student Ming Tang, who was here yesterday, received the Holtmans Award applied big data analytics to Archean fine-grained sediments, and documented a mafic to phasic transition in crustal composition at about 3.0 to 2.5 billion years ago. That marks the onset of the plate tectonics. Finally, Roberta, in collaboration with Shan Gao, carried out the most comprehensive study of the composition of the continental crust, which became the classic work in the field. Roberta is also a world leader in studies of the lithospheric mantle. She and a former PhD student, Xin-T Li, documented the lithospheric loss occurred beneath the Sierra Nevada, following Mesozoic arc magmatism, while very ancient lithosphere is preserved beneath the Colorado Plateau and northern Tanzania crater. Subsequently, Roberta and her collaborators extended their work to the North China crater and reconstructed the thermal structure, thickness, and composition of the lithospheric mantle. They proposed a continental collision model as the trigger for the destruction of the North China crater. Roberta, Bill, and their students, Xiaoming Liu, Lin Qiu, Mingtang Su Li, and others, have advanced the field of lithium isotope geochemistry. They carry out systematic studies of lithium isotope distribution in major reservoirs, investigated major processes that leading to lithium isotope fractionation. Then they applied the system to trace major geological processes. This systematic approach has been adopted by the community to study a lot of other non-traditional stable isotopes. Roberta's broad impact goes beyond geochemistry research. She has actively promoted international collaboration, mentored many next-generation geoscientists, and given countless services to the community. Her accomplishments and contributions have been well recognized by the society, as I show you here, including members of 3 academies, fellows of all societies you can imagine, and 3 awards from AGU and MSA. Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't visited the Louvre yet, you should. Commercial time. You will be amazed by the huge collection, particularly the sculptures. Even a pod geochemist like me recognize marble, rose granite, gypsum, and more. To me, these are really ordinary rocks, but they become great piece of art in the hands of an artist. Likewise, Roberta too is a remarkable artist. She transforms ordinary rocks into extraordinary scientific discoveries. Moreover, she inspires others to embark on a personal growth and transformation. This is what Xin-T drew and wrote, and all of us who know Roberta completely agree with that. Fellow geochemists and friends, in light of her outstanding achievements, excellent contributions to the community, and an exemplary role model, it's my great pleasure to introduce Roberta Rudnick as the recipient of the 2023 Goldschmidt Medal.
I can't see anybody out there, but thank you for what a wonderful citation, Banjan. Thank you so much. And if I were to extrapolate that trend, I would predict that maybe there will be a couple of Goldschmidt medalists amongst my students in the future. Well, this award means so much to me. I am humbled and deeply honored to have been selected, and I thank all who were involved at every step of the way. I've been fortunate to have many mentors throughout my career, and here I'd like to acknowledge them in some chronological order. Mr. Heil, my high school science teacher, opened up the fascinating worlds of physics, astronomy, and geology. He was an amazing teacher, and he is the reason why I went into science. And it really reinforces to me the important role that K-12 teachers play. My professors at PSU, not Penn State, but Portland State, particularly Marv Beeson, who instilled an interest in geochemistry. Denny Nelson at Sol Ross State, who started me on my geochemical research path, and comforted me when I was terribly distraught to learn that there was already a study of my master's area in West Texas, published in 1953. It's humorous now to think how upsetting this was to me, but it's a great reminder that students, particularly first-generation students such as myself, don't always understand the ins and outs of research and may need an extra hand up to understand how things work. It was certainly true for me. And I should mention that receiving an NSF graduate fellowship while I was at Sol Ross opened up a world of opportunity for me, for which I'm eternally grateful. Going to the Research School of Earth Sciences at ANU in Canberra, Australia for my PhD was a fantastic opportunity and a great adventure. It was an incredibly exciting time to be at RSES. Shrimp had just dated the first Hadean zircons. Ted Ringwood was creating megaliths in his lab, and Ross Taylor and Scott McLennan were in the process of writing their famous book on the origin and evolution of the continental crust. Ross was a terrific advisor and mentor, and as you heard earlier from Schumett, has a direct lineage from Goldschmidt, so making this award even more special. From Ross, I learned quantitative analytical trace element geochemistry, working on the spark source mass spectrometer, which used photoplates as the detection system, and computer punch cards to reduce the data. I'm really not that old, but we were a little antiquated. But the data were unsurpassed for the time, being superseded only by the advent of ICP-MS in the 1990s. The RSES also provided me with a lifelong list of friends with whom I remain in touch to this day. Taking up an Alexander von Humboldt postdoc at Max Planck Institute in Mainz, West Germany in those days, in the group of Al Hoffman, added another long list of lifelong friends and provided the opportunity to do benchtop isotope geochemistry under the tutelage of Steve Goldstein. Thus, I entered the Mainz family, which has been and continues to be a source of friendship and inspiration. After a 5-year research fellowship back at ANU with Ted Ringwood, who sadly passed away during this time, working on lithospheric mantle, I started my first faculty position at Harvard University. It was a culture shock in more ways than one, but it afforded me my first opportunity to mentor PhD students. And boy, was I fortunate to recruit Cinti Lee and Matthias Barth as my first students. Back in those days, there were no workshops nor mentoring on how to teach, how to be an effective advisor, or how to navigate tenure. I got very lucky with these two, who set the stage for an amazing array of graduate students who followed in their footsteps. Collectively, I've learned a tremendous amount from my students and consider them to be my mentors just as much as I was theirs. At the University of Maryland, where I moved in 2000, I continued to work on the lower crust and lithospheric mantle. This is the time that my research collaboration with Shan Gao really took off. Together, we investigated what happened to remove the lithospheric mantle beneath the Archean North China Craton. The destruction is now well documented, but the processes are still highly debated. And we revisited the composition of the continental crust. It was heartbreaking to lose Shan so early in life to cancer and ALS. Work on the North China Craton continued with my friend and colleague Rich Walker, collaborator Fuyuan Wu, and PhD student Jingao Liu, with a focus on highly acidophile element geochemistry. Jingao is now a professor at China University of Geosciences in Beijing and continues to make great strides in mantle and acidophile element geochemistry. It was also at the University of Maryland that I started working on lithium isotopes with a team that initially included lithium pioneer Paul Tomaschek, Bill McDonough, Fanzhen Teng, the first PhD student from China who was gone on to become a master of non-traditional stable isotopes writ large, and Tomasz Zak, my first postdoc and first Fyodor Linin fellow. That was an advantage of being a von Humboldt fellow. I could host Fyodor Linin fellows. Included in the lithium array of students were Xiaoming Liu, now an associate professor at UNC, who continues to push the forefront of lithium isotope research with a focus on continental weathering, and Ming Tang, now a professor at Peking University, and this year's Huttermans awardee, an award that recognizes his tremendous creativity on so many fronts. I'm so very proud of all of my students. I was also fortunate to work with several other talented postdocs at UMD, including Fyodor Linin Fellows Sonia Albach and Ralph Halama on various aspects of lithium isotope geochemistry, and Rich Gashnig on the glacial diamictites, about which I will speak shortly. Moving to UC Santa Barbara has opened up a new array of collaborations and excellent students. Allison Greeny, she goes by Al, made the move with me from Maryland to Santa Barbara. Together we explored the fascinating world of chalcophile element geochemistry with a focus on molybdenum and its isotopes. Al is now pushing the analytical frontiers of nuclear forensics at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Returning to my roots in the lower crust, I've been fortunate to work with PhD students Francisco Apin, now a postdoc at Princeton and soon to join the faculty at Northern Arizona University, who successfully used uranium-lead thermochronology to determine MOHO temperature, and currently Mary Ringwood, no relation to Ted, who is making great strides in understanding how sediments make it into the stable lower crust. Most recently, I've been tutored in halogen geochemistry by my PhD student, Pengyuan Han. In addition, UCSB has a large and talented pool of undergraduate students who are a delight to teach, and a number of whom I've been fortunate to mentor in research. Finally, I wish to thank my family, my siblings, my cousin Carol, who's here today, and my parents, now deceased, for their lifelong support, Bill McDonough and my son Patrick, who had a rather unusual childhood that included several trips to Tanzania. Thank you all too for your love and support. Can you see that? Is that working right for a pointer? No? Okay, hold on a second. That's a pen. Highlighter. Nope, laser pointer. Got it. Okay. Well, so today I want to tell you about a project that we've been working on for about the last 10 years on glacial diamictites and using these to estimate upper continental crust composition. I'd like to start this with an acknowledgement that there's been a huge number of people involved in the research. Some of them are shown here, but not all of them. These are the students and the main students and postdocs who have worked on this. And also, of course, funding agencies and funding institutions, such as the University of Maryland, CUG, Wuhan, and Santa Barbara. There are many more that I can't picture here, but you'll see as we go through the talk some of their work. So why study the upper continental crust? It's obviously the most accessible portion of the Earth. Surely we know its composition better than just about any other reservoir on Earth. But the reason we wanted to revisit this was because it's chock full of incompatible trace elements and incompatible elements in general, including thorium, uranium, and potassium, the heat-producing elements. And even though it's only 0.5% by mass of the silicate Earth, it contains, depending on whose values you want to look at here, a very large proportion of these critically important elements. And we wanted to try to address this by a different method, and so this is why we turned to glacial diamictites. So here's the outline of what I'm going to go through today. First, I'm going to introduce you to the rationale and the samples. It's an old but new idea. It's old because it started with Goldschmidt. It's new because we're looking at crust composition through time. The two main signals that we see in the diamictites is that they record the rise of atmospheric oxygen, and they also record evidence for changing composition of the upper continental crust from dominantly mafic to more felsic between 2.9 and 2.4, around the end of the Archean. And finally, I'll just show a couple of slides of some of the ongoing work. Now, I talked about this in 2019 in the plenary lecture at Goldschmidt, and so some of this will be repeat, but I'd like to focus here today on some of the newer results as well. So apologies if you can go to sleep, I guess, if you've heard part of this before. Okay, so glaciers physically erode the surface of the earth, and they grind up the rock as they go. And that's why Goldschmidt suggested that we could go out and collect this rock flour that they make and get an average composition of the area that the glaciers traversed. And during the ice ages, when we had continental scale ice sheets, this could give us a very nice average of the surface that the glaciers were sampling. Now, diamictites do not have to be glacial in origin. It just means a poorly sorted rock. But the glacial diamictites are recognized on the basis of having striated cobbles, shown here, and also drop stones in associated laminated sediments. And these are believed to have melted out of icebergs and dropped from the icebergs into the soft sediment below. So that's the evidence that people have used. And I'll just note that we relied on previous people's studies to identify these as glacial in origin. We were not going out and discovering new deposits. Our project was to analyze this fine-grained matrix of the diamictites and do this through time with a number of goals in place. One is to refine the composition of the upper continental crust, but importantly, to put some uncertainties on that composition, because all previous estimates of upper continental crust have no error bars. And so you taught this as a young geochemist, that a number is not a number unless you have an error associated with it. So that was part of our goal. We wanted to see if there was evidence for temporal change in the upper continental crust composition through time. We also wanted to investigate lesser known elements, ones that are not sort of routinely, or at least in the past, were not routinely analyzed. At this conference, you'll hear a lot about some of these elements. Things like molybdenum, antimony, tin, a lot of the P block group elements of the periodic table, and halogens. And we wanted to create an upper crustal reference suite that we could make available to the community. I was a student of Ross Taylor's. I inherited some of his classic shales that he and others used to characterize upper continental crust. And people have asked me for those over the years, and I've always provided them, but some of them are the vials are almost empty now. And so we thought, well, if we're gonna go to the trouble of collecting all these samples and processing them, let's make enough to share widely. So we have a fair number of samples, about 175 individual samples, and this is just a list of some of the formations that we collected, and there's many more than this. This color coding here, green for Paleozoic, red for Neoproterozoic, blue for Paleoproterozoic, and black for Archean, is the color code I'm going to use in the geochemical plots that I'm going to show in a bit. Here's an example. This is a 2.9 bona fide glacial deposit. Grant Young worked on this and found striated clasts. He found drop stones. So this is deposited in South Africa. It's the Mozon group. So we created composites for each of the formations, and these composites consisted of something between 3 and 13 individual samples. So there's 24 composites in total, and from multiple outcrops, and we did this using just equal weight powder. And those are the samples that most people analyze, because nobody wants to analyze 175 samples usually. This is a field shot from the Superior Province that shows the nature of the rocks. There, you can see it's very poorly sorted. It's this fine-grained matrix here that we were after. And so a couple of very industrious undergraduate students broke these rocks up and pulverized them, and that's the origin of the powders. Okay, so what's being sampled? Well, this is a plot of silica versus aluminum, and these are the individual samples. And you can see that these are anything but homogeneous in composition. There's a very wide range of major element compositions, but they follow along some trends, which probably mixing between clay and feldspar on one end, quartz on another. And then there's these trends that are orthogonal to this main trend, and those are created by carbonate-bearing samples, and also samples that are sampling iron formation. So some of the older samples, in particular in the Archean and Paleoproterozoic, were collecting iron formations as glaciers traveled across the surface. Now, the main motivation for starting this project in the first place was that we thought, because this is a physical pulverization by the glaciers, we could potentially avoid the problems of chemical weathering, which of course affects shales because they're products of chemical weathering. And so we really were hoping we could pin down some of the more soluble elements in the crust by looking at these glacial deposits. So woe to us. The first thing we noticed is that carry a very strong weathering signature. They're not unweathered upper continental crust. This is the chemical index of alteration, CIA. Here it is, here's how you calculate it from moles of aluminum, which is insoluble, to aluminum plus all these soluble elements. Igneous rocks will plot over here, and as rocks weather, they get higher and higher in the CIA. And very few of our samples are unweathered. So that was a little bit depressing at the outset, because there goes the whole rationale for doing this project. But we studied this weathering signature, trying to determine where it came from. Was it post-depositional, syn-depositional, pre-depositional? And we ended up concluding that mostly it's derived from the provenance. So when the glaciers were moving across the landscape, they were scraping off some bedrock, but they were scraping off a lot of soil and regolith. And maybe that's not too surprising in retrospect, but the reason we thought that they might give us an unweathered sample was because I was thinking about, the Superior Craton, for example, where repeated advances and retreats of ice sheets have removed all the regolith in the first advance, and then you can go back and sample the bedrock as brought down by the glaciers. But this apparently didn't happen very often in the ancient Earth. Anyway, so here we are, we're stuck with this result. It turns out to be, we found some interesting things. So first, a word about data presentation. These are the light rare earth elements, molybdenum and strontium, where they would plot in an igneous rock. So the way, I'm going to show you some plots that are double normalized. So we take the concentration in the sample, we divide it by average upper continental crust, and then we normalize to an element we assume is relatively immobile, like aluminum or perhaps yttrium, to remove dilution effects caused by addition of quartz or addition of carbonate that don't contain these elements. And you can see here, one would be where these samples would plot where we think the upper continental crust composition, or the previous estimates of upper continental crust composition, would lie, and most of the rare earths lie very close to that, the light rare earths here. But you can see that strontium is systematically depleted, as is molybdenum, and that's a weathering signature. And we can quantify the degree of depletion just as if we were calculating a europium anomaly by interpolating what would be the strontium concentration if there was no if there was no anomaly, and basically same formula that we'd use for europium anomaly. Well, so the strontium depletion that's seen in just about every single sample is a signature of chemical weathering. But what got very interesting, despite this depressing news that they're weathered, was that we could see that some elements that are redox sensitive, like molybdenum, changed through time. So here we call these W plots because they kind of look like a W. And so here's the Paleozoic, and you can see they all show the W shape. Same thing for Neoproterozoic. In fact, the Neoproterozoic samples are perhaps the most strongly oxidatively weathered samples. But then if we go all the way back to the Archean, we don't tend to see the molybdenum depletion, but we still see the strontium depletion. And the CIA of those Archean samples is very high. So it tells us that they suffered, or they experienced, or maybe enjoyed, who knows, chemical weathering. But molybdenum was not soluble. And that's because there was no oxygen in the atmosphere at the time of the weathering. And then in the Paleoproterozoic, we see a mixed signal. Well, first of all, this one doesn't show weathering. But if we go to those that do, with the strontium depletion, you can see that some of them are not molybdenum depleted and others are. And so what we're seeing is the rise of atmospheric oxygen, the great oxidation event, where we went from anoxic surface to oxidative weathering. And we see this not only in molybdenum, but we see it in other redox-sensitive elements like vanadium. Here's vanadium, vanadium star. These up here would have experienced anoxic weathering. Those are mostly blue and black. These down here experienced oxidative weathering, and they're mostly red and green. And the same thing for thorium and uranium, because uranium, as many of you know, is also redox sensitive, where 6+ is soluble, 4+ is insoluble. So same sort of pattern. And then there's one very interesting formation called Deutschland, which is Paleoproterozoic, but it has a very, very strong oxidative weathering signature. And if I didn't know its depositional age, I would say it was probably Neoproterozoic because it's so strongly oxidative weathered. It has this very strong oxidative weathering signature. And then Algrini, during her PhD, analyzed molybdenum isotopes in these samples. And so this is a plot of depositional age versus the delta 98 molybdenum. Unweathered igneous rocks plot in this yellow field. So in the Archean, even though these are very strongly weathered, their CIA is very high, they're strontium depleted, they have igneous-like molybdenum isotopes. We get into the Paleoproterozoic and we start to see some deviation towards lighter molybdenum values, which is probably due to molybdenum isotope fractionation from manganese oxides that form in an oxidative weathering environment, and loss of heavy molybdenum to the waters. And then when we get to the Neoproterozoic, we get these really strongly depleted or low delta 98 molybdenum, and also in the Paleozoic. And this is the field of iron manganese oxides. Organic carbon could also play a role, but we don't see an important role for organic carbon because there's not much in the samples. Again, there's the Deutschland sample. It's a real outlier. Interestingly, I'm not going to talk about this further in this talk, but James Doughton and colleagues have done sulfur isotope analyses, and this carries a very strong mass-independent fractionation signal. And that will be something we report in the future. We're working on those data now. But it may be that it suggests that the surface of the Earth was strongly oxidatively weathered, and then oxygen dropped to zero again to create the MIF that was deposited with this sample. Most of the samples don't have a MIF signature at all, irrespective of their age. Anyway, that's for the future. Okay, so weathering, the rise of oxygen was the first big signal we saw in these. The second one is this apparent change in upper continental crust composition. So this is a normalized diagram just like the others, except now we're looking at the heavy rare earth elements, and we're looking at some transition metals, again plotted in their supposed order from igneous differentiation: vanadium, scandium, chromium, cobalt, nickel. And they're color-coded as before. These are averages now of individual samples rather than the composites, but they should look very similar to the composites. What you'll notice is that the heavy rare earths are all on top of one another. There's not much variation in them. But when we get to these transition metals, we see a lot of variation. And generally speaking, we see Archean and Paleoproterozoic samples having high concentrations, and the Paleozoic and Neoproterozoic samples having low concentrations. So blue and black up here, red and green down here. And not only is there an overall change in concentration, but there's a change in the ratios. So here's positive vanadium, negative vanadium anomaly, positive chromium anomaly, negative chromium anomaly, and nickel cobalt changes systematically. Now, some of these, like vanadium, we think are due to the change in oxidative weathering, and some of them are probably due to intercrustal differentiation. For example, nickel cobalt is a very good proxy for igneous differentiation, and that's shown here. So this is where Ming Tong comes into the picture. He would sit in on our glacial diamictite group meetings and listen to what we were discovering, and he thought, well, this is really interesting. And he went off and collected data from GeoRock database for Archean igneous rocks and meta-igneous samples, plotted them here, magnesium versus nickel cobalt, magnesium versus chromium zinc, another ratio that he discovered correlates with differentiation. And here are the averages for Archean sediments. Now, he included shales as well as diamictites in this. And if you use this ratio and extrapolate to magnesium, you can see it's going to imply a very high MgO concentration versus the post-Archean sediments, both shales and diamictites. And he used this to suggest that the MgO concentration of the upper crust changed quite dramatically from a crazy high value here of almost 15 weight% oxygen, magnesium oxide, down to values very similar to modern day across this late Archean period. And then thinking very simplistically, well, what could cause that? Well, as Nick Arndt will tell you, you need to produce granite. And so how do you create a lot of granite? You could produce it through subduction. In fact, there was a very famous paper, Campbell and Taylor, Ross Taylor, 1983, no water, no granites, no oceans, no continents. Okay, so the idea is that maybe this very strong change we see in the composition of sediments over the late Archean reflects the wide-scale initiation or wide-scale occurrence, let's say, of subduction and a way to generate granites by adding water to the depth. Okay, but one has to ask, I suppose, do the changes reflect a less evolved crust or just a change in an ultramafic member? Maybe the Archean crust was perfectly felsic and you just had more komatiite in it, and that could potentially explain these differences. So along comes Kang Chen, who teamed up with me. Kang was a visiting PhD student from CUG Wuhan, and they noted that as igneous rocks differentiate from an ultramafic komatiite to a basalt to a granite, the copper concentrations show the chevron shape. This is because these ultramafic rocks are differentiating that they don't have sulfide in them, so copper concentrations rise dramatically, and then when sulfur becomes saturated, they drop precipitously. And so copper is uniquely suited to ask the question, how much mafic rock, not just komatiite, but how much mafic rock was present at the time of deposition of the sediments. And these are the data. These are individual samples in green and composite samples in orange for the glacial diamictites. And you can see that the copper concentrations systematically decrease over the same time period, from the Archean to the post-Archean. And these are just the median and the average of those, the glacial diamictite data. And so this strongly suggests that, in fact, there was a lot more basalt. It wasn't just komatiite that was present in the Archean upper crust, the earlier Archean upper continental crust. And you can do some mass balance calculations mixing between basalt, granite, and komatiite, and you end up with almost inescapable. The basalt had to represent a significant portion, anywhere from 50 to 90% of the exposed crust that these glaciers were sampling. Okay, last little bit, some data we just published this year, although we've been working on this for quite some time. These are data from Fang Huang's lab, and Zhiyu Tian did these as I think an undergraduate student before she went to Paris to do her PhD. And this is using vanadium isotopes, vanadium stable isotopes, as a proxy for igneous differentiation. So here's a plot of silica versus delta 51 vanadium. Here's a plot of magnesium versus delta 51 vanadium, and you can see there's a pretty good positive correlation in both of these plots. And both tholeiitic and calc-alkaline rocks plot on the same trend. Okay, and also I should mention that vanadium isotopes are not fractionated by chemical weathering. I thought they would be. I was very surprised to see pretty good data from weathering profiles that they do not fractionate. But you'll notice that there's a few samples, a couple of igneous suites that plot at much higher delta 51 vanadium. And those are Hekla in Iceland and Mariana Anatahan arc. Okay, both of these go very high. Now these are data that Julie Petulik published in her pioneering paper on vanadium isotopes in GPL in 2017. So we were worried about this. Why are Fang's data so different, generally speaking, than the data previously published for some of the suites, not all of them? And so we reached out to Julie and asked her if she could send us some samples so that we could do cross-laboratory analysis. This is the way science should be done. Julie said, of course. And she sent us the samples, and Fang and his folks analyzed them in the lab. One of them is shown here. You can sort of hidden behind the other sample, but it was spot on the same. And the other one, which had a little bit more extreme, or quite a bit more extreme isotopic analyses, ended up being not within uncertainty, but still, nevertheless, extremely high, extremely heavy isotopic composition. So we think there's no problem with these data. This is a real fractionation. Okay, so how do we use these sorts of data to apply to the diamictites to say something about crust composition? Well, first of all, let's address those strange, very heavy samples from Hekla and Anatahan. So they're shown here on a plot of SiO2 versus iron number, and they're all up here. They're all extremely iron rich, and even the most primitive in the suites have very, very high iron to magnesium ratio. And comparing those to the gray data, this is the our database Archean greenstone belt lavas, ranging from basalt to rhyolite. You can see that they're sitting above the trend. They started out very iron rich and got even more iron rich through differentiation. And so we don't think that they are representative of what was going on in the Archean, which is shown here as a running average. So we excluded those from further consideration, and we used the main trend that we saw from both Hawaii and various calc-alkaline suites to use as a proxy for differentiation. And here are the vanadium isotope data for the diamictites. So here's our Archean samples. This is the mid-ocean ridge basalt field here. And you can see that systematically these vanadium isotopes get heavier over time in these glacial sediments. And so this trend also suggests progressively more felsic crust with time. And again, you can do the mass balance, or you can do a mass mixing calculation using three components, komatiite, granite, and basalt. And you can see that they record a change from dominantly mafic to felsic crust between 2.9 and today. So this would be the silica concentration, this would be the MgO concentration. Now, a caveat to this is that we only have Archean glacial samples from one craton, which is Kapval. And so this may not be representative of the world. It would be nice to look at some samples from other areas, but this is the data that we have. And I should note also that the Paleoproterozoic samples come from a variety of different regions. And in addition, if you go back to nickel cobalt and believe the arguments that it's not just komatiite, then the shale data from all different regions of the world show the same trend. So maybe this reflects a transition. Here's the Pilbara Craton. We've heard a fair amount about it at this conference, with big granite intrusions surrounded by mafic greenstones, which may have been a very different tectonic style in the Archean, to linear arcs of above subducting slabs that we see today. So, how did Earth's continents change through time? So maybe we probably started with a magma ocean, although we were debating this earlier because, Vicki Bennett earlier showed pervasive 142 neodymium anomalies in Greenland, which would suggest that you can preserve those heterogeneities somehow through the magma ocean. So that's very interesting. To perhaps something like Venus, where we are quite confident there's no plate tectonics going on in Venus. We don't know how much felsic crust might exist on Venus. It's probably dominated by mafic, but fortunately NASA, and maybe I think ESA is involved as well, are going to run a mission to Venus again to interrogate the surface. I guess it has to step back though from the Mars. Mars goes first. So maybe we'll know more about Venus, but it's certainly very different from Earth to what we see today on Earth with modern continents and plate tectonics and spreading ridges and subduction. So there's certainly some sort of transition that went on. It's a big debate. If you've been listening to any of the Earth evolution sessions, you'll see how big of a debate it is. Nobody agrees, but that's good. We can always keep in our jobs, I guess. So to summarize, glacial diamictites provide a new avenue to explore the composition of the upper crust through time. They record the composition of weathered upper continental crust. They record the rise of atmospheric oxygen and changing upper continental crust composition at the end of the Archean. These samples are extremely well analyzed now. Major elements and most trace elements, including things like platinum group elements and halogens. Pan Yuan Han had a paper on halogens, which is very interesting. Don't have time to go into it, but who'd have thought you'd want to measure halogens in these? Turns out it's quite interesting. All of these stable isotope systems, osmium shouldn't be in there, it's down here. Good thing Rich Walker's not here. Anyway, he's giving a talk in another session. And some radiogenic isotopes. And here's just a list of the papers that have been published so far on these samples, and more to come. 2 talks from now, Funjun Teng will talk about potassium isotopes in these samples. Paul Savage is also simultaneously talking about copper isotopes, but you can watch it online. So thank you for your attention, and I'll take questions.
Fascinating talk. Thank you very much, Roberta. So we have time for question.
I thought Bill White was going to ask a question. You just walked right on by.
Yeah.
Oh, Nick.
I knew it was on the way, but chickened out. Huh? Okay. Well, Roberta, very nice talk as usual. And I'm going to ask the same question I ask after every one of your talks on this subject. Fine, you got very good evidence that the material sampled by the diamictites probably contained a much higher proportion of basalt and a significant portion of komatiite.
In the Archean.
In the Archean.
Yeah.
But what does this mean? Could it simply mean that there was normal granitic crust which formed, I would say, by plate tectonic processes, but this crust was overlain by thick flood basalts containing a high komatiite component and invaded by numerous dikes and intrusions, which would be consistent with the crust having formed by processes very similar to those of today?
Yeah, well, we can't say, because what we're analyzing is upper continental crust. By definition, it's the stuff that the glaciers were scraping off. And we don't have depth information. And I also want to point out, I'm not implying there were no granites. There are certainly granites and TTGs, very important in the Archean. It's just a question of what their proportion was at that time. Mm-hmm. And so at the surface, it would appear that it's dominated by basalt.
Okay, but this does not necessarily imply then some change in geodynamic regime at the end of the Archean, does it?
Well, we don't see that today so much, do we?
No, but the mantle was hotter. Isn't it simply? Why aren't we simply seeing a?
What about density of melts? What about melt density? Aren't they denser? Why would they come up to the surface? Why wouldn't they underplate and interplate?
Well, we know komatiites get to the surface. They've erupted on continental.
Yeah, so do rhyolites. Yeah. Anyway, we can debate this.
We'll continue to debate.
I think we can't say, it's really, we all wave our arms about what the tectonics was. But, how well can we definitively say it's not very easy?
We can't, right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Has anyone looked at the modern environment in terms of glacial materials where we know what's been eroded to actually test the hypothesis that underlies all this, that the glacial materials actually represent what's there?
Yes, Dante Canil, actually, I should have mentioned his work. He took data from the Canadian Geological Survey, but these were not actually ice sheets. These were mountain glaciers in BC, British Columbia. And he had a paper in chemical geology where he showed that they were a pretty good match to the catchment area or the area that the glaciers were coming from. But what would be a really interesting study, I think, would be to look at the Pleistocene deposits. Actually, Peter Clark at Oregon State has done this, and first ice sheets coming off of the Canadian Shield, in fact, are dumping out sediment that is highly weathered, glacial till that's highly weathered, and then the subsequent ones are less weathered. But it would be really interesting to go back and look at those Pleistocene deposits in a time sequence and see how they change in terms of the weathering signature and also their bulk compositions. So there's plenty of work to be done on this area. So it was Canil and can't remember the second author. It was two-authored paper in chemical geology. If anybody's interested, just drop me a line and send it to you.
Some more questions for Roberta? One more coming up.
Hi, Roberta.
Hi.
Nice talk. When you were finishing your talk, I was just making the connection with Min Tang's talk yesterday. And I thought, what you show is clearly a proof that there was something above seawater level. And I was, Jenny came to me the question of how much do we know of the atmosphere temperature in the Archean? Has it been used, to try to I mean, you know, I mean, you're talking about glaciers, so it's a clear fact. So how does it compare to the data that exists on, you know, past climate records?
Yeah, I don't know how well constrained atmospheric temperature was in the Archean. People have certainly thought about Archean seawater, and some of them have said it's very hot. But yet we have glacial deposits. I mean, it's obviously not the same everywhere over the globe, but I don't know that that's particularly well constrained. But another important point, though, that your question raises is, you know, when did continents emerge? Well, obviously, these glaciers are scraping the top of the continents, but most of them are glacial marine in terms of the glaciers went off into the ocean and then melted and dumped their load in the shallow marine environment, which is why we see for example, in the Deutschland, why we see this sulfur coming from the seawater with the MIF signal and strong MIF signal. But if you look at the Trigeminous sedimentary record, you'll see that, you know, you go to the oldest rocks, it's pretty hard to find shales. You see a lot of chemical sediments like cherts, banded iron formations, but you don't see a lot of shales. And so that would be evidence in my book that maybe there wasn't too much above sea level. So I buy the continental emergence. I think there's a lot of data. Ilya Bindemann's work on oxygen isotopes, a lot of data that suggests that there wasn't a lot of subaerial landmass in the Archean until the late Archean, after 3 billion maybe. Was there a question over here?
Yes, there was. Thank you for a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a basic question. In a lot of your data, where you're looking at trace elements, say copper, etc., and you're looking at it through time, there seems to be a lot more variability in the data in the earlier Earth than there is in the more modern Earth. Is that correct? And
more variability in the copper data than in...
Yeah, and also in some other trace elements, I noticed. I'm just wondering, does that mean there was more diversity in signal, or what does it mean?
So, well, there's a lot of variability in a lot of the data, and that first major element plot I showed you shows that there's actually a huge variation in major elements, which is why it's kind of remarkable that we see any trends whatsoever in my, you know, this could have been a complete flop and we see nothing, but fortunately we saw some signal in the data. But copper, you know, one of the questions is how soluble is copper, but copper is relatively insoluble, but not perfectly, so there could be some mobility. But this is from Taylor and McLennan's book. This is the seawater residence time versus what they call the partition coefficient between continents and seawater. And these elements down here are all very insoluble. These are very soluble, and here's where copper plots. They shaded it black as insoluble, but it's sort of, you know. But the fact that we see, so I think copper should be relatively good proxy, but it could be slightly influenced by some weathering.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. It's a good thing we had a break after this.
Yeah, so if there is one more question.
Thank you so much for a great talk. My question's also a bit basic, just about them being like glacial deposits, so they're eroding existing crust, and like sort of what your speculations are on like that time lag of how much older that crust could have been, and if you've thought about that in regards to the weathering signals and like the strength of that. Yeah,
good question. Well, Rich Gashnig did some detrital zircon work on these samples, and also Mary Horan analyzed them for neodymium isotopes, and so obviously the provenance is older than the depositional age. But one thing I didn't point out, actually, which is kind of interesting, I don't know if I can quickly go back, not very easily, but there's one sample that's Paleozoic in age. Here it is. This green one that's up here with the blue and the black. Well, that's a sample, that's West Duica in South Africa, and there the glaciers were scraping off the surface at 300 million years, but they were scraping Archean crust. And you can see that in the detrital zircons, you can see it in the whole rock composition. So that's kind of cool.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you again, Roberta, and congratulations on the
Thank you.
award again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.